So this is an explanation of the key events and key themes in Sac de Billes, chapter 4. So this chapter starts and the boys are leaving Paris. They're setting off in their new life. They've got this new identity in that they are not allowed to tell anyone that they are Jewish. And they are en route to the ligne de démarcation, which separates occupied France and the free zone. So there's two key events in this chapter. First of all, we've got the chaos of the journey itself, which shows the state of panic that a lot of people were in at this time. So the boys arrive at the Gare d'Austerlitz, and there are people everywhere. So in your book, it starts on page 59 as they arrive at the train station. And it talks about the fact that les quais sont envahis. And on page 61, there's this idea that les wagons sont bondés. So everywhere is filled to bursting. There's people everywhere. There's just a general sense of chaos and disorder in this train station. The second event, which I'll talk about later, is the incident with the priest. So let's go back to the Gare d'Austerlitz. There are people everywhere and the boys struggle to get on the train. They have to walk further and further down, and as they get on, they see 3 empty compartments, but they're all reserved for German soldiers. So they keep walking. They find a tiny, tiny little space that they cram in, and they cram themselves into this corner because it is literally the only space left. So there's this real sense of panic that people are starting to flee from Paris. And there's also this sense that many people on the train are the kind of people who would be persecuted by the Nazis. Interestingly, as they are setting off, Joe sees a train coming into Paris in the other direction. This is on page 63. And he says that sur la voie qui nous fait face, il y a un autre train presque vide, celui-là. So the trains coming into Paris are practically empty, but the trains leaving Paris are absolutely crammed full. So there's a real sense of desperation. Later on, they meet the grandma. They have a little chat. They have something to eat. Joe falls asleep and he has this very bizarre nightmare. As he wakes up, he notices that the carriage is starting to empty. And Maurice explains to him that people started to jump off the train. So again, we get this rising sense of panic. First of all, there was the panic amidst the chaos of the train station. Now we've got this panic of approaching danger because they know that when they get to Dax, they're going to be asked about their papers. So Joe's waking up, the carriage is emptying, and Maurice tells him on page 70, il y en a beaucoup qui ont sorti en marche au ralentissement. So there's lots of them that have already jumped off whilst we've been moving as the train's slowing down. These are clearly the people who have got something to hide, like the boys, or who don't have the correct papers. There's also a description of German soldiers moving towards the carriages. So you've got this quite intimidating paragraph on page 70. Le haut-parleur résonne. Il y a une longue phrase en allemand. Et soudain, je les vois. Ils sont une dizaine sur les quais. Ils traversent la voie et viennent vers nous. And he's describing these German soldiers who've got all these metal links around them. But there are also people dressed not in soldiers' uniform, en imperméable, and this links, this idea that they're dressed in raincoats links to our idea of Gestapo-type officers who had a reputation for being dangerous and sinister. So there's a real sense of panic at this point on page 70, 71, 72. People have started jumping down from the train. People who have got their papers are still really intimidated. We've got this description on page 71 of a woman holding her papers, trembling. On page 72, we see this couple who've run off and been stopped by the Nazis. We see them being walked back, escorted by soldiers, and there's gunshots, there's people running, jumping from the train. It's very, very intimidating, very chaotic. This is the sense of danger. This is the reality of war. So obviously one of the key themes in this novel is about war. The second important incident in this chapter, perhaps the most important incident in this chapter, is what happens with the priest. When they got on the train, Joe noticed that there was a priest on the train, and over the course of the journey, he's noticed that the priest has been watching them. As the train has started to empty, a place becomes available next to the priest, and Joe goes and sits next to him. Perhaps he feels that he'll be safe, sees him as a responsible adult. And on page 72, Joe turns to him and says, "Monsieur le curé, nous n'avons pas de papier. We don't have any papers." And at this point, the priest takes control and he says to the boys, don't be scared. If they sense that you're scared, the Germans will pick up on it. And essentially at this point, the priest saves them, probably saves their lives. The Germans are working down the carriage, and when they get to the priest, he hands over his papers, and he has a little bit of a joke with the German soldier. This is on page 74. He shows him the picture, and the priest says, "J'ai un peu maigri, mais c'est bien moi." Well, I've slimmed out a bit, but it's me. And he goes on to say, oh, the war, all these restrictions. And the German soldier takes this in good humour, and he gives him back his paper and says, very important phrase, "Les enfants sont avec moi." The children are with me. And in that word alone, in that phrase alone, the soldier accepts that the children are Catholic, maybe, certainly not Jewish, that if the priest says that they are fine, then that's good enough for him. So to put this into context, lots of German soldiers at the time were still very religious. Priests carried a lot of authority. So the fact that this priest has stood up for the boys and said, yep, they're travelling with me, that's enough to give them the validation that they need. If he hadn't have done that, there is every chance that the boys would have been arrested at this point. So this is a key turning point. The very first time here that we see somebody stepping in to save the boys, and in doing so, he probably stops them from being arrested and sent to a transit camp and later on to a concentration camp. Okay, the end of the chapter, we've got the priest taking them off to a cafe. We see the restrictions of the war because the coffee isn't really coffee, it's ersatz, which is a product, a replacement product. And lots of things that you would expect to be able to buy in a cafe aren't there. The boys explain to them that they're heading towards the demarcation line, and it is clear from the priest's reaction that he knows why the boys are doing this, that he understands that they're Jewish, that they need to get into the free zone. That is never referred to, but it is clear that the priest knows what he has got himself involved with. The priest, to some extent, represents les justes de la France, these people who were given the title by the State of Israel after the war, people who actively helped Jewish people in France during the war. Lots of priests were involved in helping and sheltering Jewish boys, but there were an equal number that weren't. There was no benefit to Catholics in protecting Jews. In fact, historically, the Catholics had been involved in the persecution of Jews. So we can look at this and we can say that the priest represents this large cohort of people who are actively helping and therefore putting themselves at risk, because there is a phrase that comes up later in the novel, but it was very clear that the Nazis made it very clear that anybody who was found to be helping Jews would suffer a similar fate. And there are plenty of stories of Catholic priests who ended up in concentration camps. So this priest was putting himself in danger by helping the boys. Okay, other things to think about in this chapter. Themes. Well, we see a little bit more about the relationship between Joe and Maurice here. Maurice, remember, is 2 years older than Joe. He takes the lead when they are in the station, and he gets Joe to look with him at this line of people. They need to jump the queue, otherwise they're going to miss the train. And he says to Joe, which do you think looks the nicest? And once they've done that, Maurice approaches the man, tells him a bit of a lie about Joe being exhausted and how they need to get their tickets. And he queue jumps like that. On page 64, we see him taking the lead with the grandma about where they're going, that they're going to rejoin their sick parents in the south of France. So we see Maurice stepping into the role of parent in this chapter. Another key theme that we've already discussed is le mensonge. So it is essential at this point that the boys lie about their identity. They lie to jump the queue. They lie to the grandma. And Joe actually feels very bad about this. But they tell her that their surname is Martin. On page 64, we see them telling her that their names are Joseph and Maurice Martin, which is it's the French equivalent of Smith. It's a very, very common surname. But Joe feels bad about this. And we met Père Boulier in chapter 3. There's a paragraph on page 64 where Joe is remembering the things that Père Boulier used to say to him. On ne doit jamais mentir, you must never lie. Un menteur n'est jamais cru, a liar is never believed. Joe, the author, the adult, is saying, well, he never had the Gestapo on his tail. Il n'a jamais eu la Gestapo derrière lui. But Joe feels uneasy with these lies that they are telling. But straight away, they follow their dad's advice, and they do so to protect their identity. There is even, let's say, a white lie at the end of this chapter, because the grandma that they've met, it becomes clear later on in the chapter that she's also Jewish from the colour of the paper that she's holding. Joe asks the priest right at the end what happened to her. This is on page 78. Qu'est-ce qu'ils lui ont fait à la grand-mère? What did they do to the grandma? And the priest says, well, nothing. She didn't have her papers. Ils l'ont renvoyée chez elle. They sent her back home. And Joe, the child, says, wow, yeah, that's true. Why didn't I think of that? I imagined that she'd be in prison. What do I know? Now, the adult reader understands that actually she'd been arrested, but the priest told this white lie to protect the boys a little bit. Okay, and the last theme that comes through in this chapter is the humanity of others. It is largely the priest. The priest saves them, but the grandma wants them to feel comfortable. She sees that they're travelling on their own without parents. She shares the little food and drink that she has with them. So we start to see, in spite of the terrible situation that other people have been put in, we start to see sparks of goodness in people. L'humanité et la gentillesse. People helping the boys in spite of their own difficult circumstances. And this chapter ends with the boys in Dax buying their tickets to go to Aguedmo. Fini.